Hello, and welcome to What We've Learned, a podcast where we discuss what we've learned, what we've seen, and what we've observed in the last few days in our world of marketing, but also in the wider world of business. Who's the we? Well, it's myself, Steve Kemish, and it's my long-term friend and industry peer, Shane Redding. Shane and I are here to talk about a few topics, and Shane's going to lead us off with the first one. So, Shane, hello.
Hello, Steve.
How are you?
I'm okay. And I think the important thing to kick off with this is that this is because this is all a very brave new world for us, or not such a brave world. And really, what we want to share on this podcast is the things that we're learning through this crisis. And also, we really hope that people will join the conversation with their tips, hints, learnings, and particularly the challenges they face, because I think for all of us in isolation at the moment, it's helping each other. And that's very much going to be the theme of this podcast going forwards. And we're going to start off by having a bit of a chat about the importance of strategic and contingency planning.
Good topic. Yes, very relevant topic always, but certainly now. Yeah, and a nice point around that help. We'll kick off this discussion, but as we go, any input from others, and we've put this onto SoundCloud where you can leave comments, but particularly on LinkedIn, if you've got anything to share around what we've discussed, we'd be really happy to hear. Okay then, so what's the week been like for you, Shane? What have you thought from a strategic and contingency planning point of view?
I think firstly, it's been incredibly busy. And I think that's really interesting because people are having to react so fast to basically daily changing situations. So in terms of the strategic planning, a lot of it is obviously around contingency planning. And what I've seen, it doesn't matter whether it's a small business or it's a large corporate, is just how critical excellent leadership is. And I think that's really come across more than anything, and actually what that means. And I'd be interested from your point of view, Steve, because I know within your business you have a team and those learnings, and how are you leading the team?
Yeah, so it's funny actually, just listening to what you've been saying. I think you've got to have that contingency, but it's so rapid fire. It almost feels like, and we've talked about this before separately, agile business and agile marketing, which is an easily used term, but my goodness, if ever there's been a need to be agile and to make quick and strong decisions, it's now. I mean, for us at Junction as a marketing agency, it's actually business as usual to the greater or lesser extent. The technology that's out there to allow collaboration that we've been using for quite a long time, so 6 years old, and probably worked collaboratively in this way for most of that time. However, the human angle, of course, is many of the team are husbands or wives or particularly parents, and therefore it's juggling. And I think this is the thing that a lot of organizations, of course, are trying to not just think about that leadership of what it means for the team of employees to keep the wheels of business turning, but also to be a decent human being and recognize where productivity might have to change because of families and other commitments and other concerns. I don't think I've seen that any more apparently in the relaxed nature of using Zoom and it being okay at last, that if a child wanders into the background or somebody makes a noise, that it's not the most heinous crime ever. We've become a lot more relaxed because of this rapid change that we're seeing.
I think that's absolutely right. I think that empathy in the way that we deal with each other is really important, and that doesn't matter whether that's internal employee communications, whether it's with external colleagues. I did my first ever Zoom pitch completely remote, in fact,
Wow.
to a possible client in Switzerland. And it was really interesting because I just think everybody wants it to work, and there's a lot of goodwill there to try and get people using the new technology feeling relaxed with it. But there's no doubt about it. Leading remote teams is hugely challenging, and you're lucky. You've got experience. I've had experience with both my training and my consulting doing it remotely, but we're all learning. We're learning new stuff every day. And I think that it's sharing those tips that I think is really important. So as you say, first one, just relax. Everybody has different problems to overcome. And I saw a fantastic tweet, which I might actually share later on the LinkedIn comments, from a CEO basically saying the most important thing to me is my employees and their families' health and safety. And I thought that just summed it up brilliantly.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, we always talk about culture coming from the top, but never is. And I wrote something on LinkedIn, a very small piece on this last week about we talk about customer experience, but what about employee experience? I think you're really going to understand as an employee, your boss and the leaders in your organization at a moment like this as to whether they genuinely have your interests at heart. Or indeed, maybe they, do they run for the hills versus actually just try and help out and behave like a human in the ranks, which is so important.
I agree. And I think whatever size business you are, I mean, obviously, very large organizations have contingency plans, disaster planning, but even they're finding that those plans, I won't quite say rip them up, but there are big holes in them. And what you need is you need your staff to step up and basically take responsibility and ownership. And people really want to do that. They want to do the right thing. Okay, we're not all like the heroes on the front line of the NHS and other critical services. But what was interesting to me, I was on a call earlier with Scott from IBM, and he said, the realization for them at IBM is their technology is being used by the frontline companies, so it is critical. And I think, that's really interesting thing to reflect on in marketing and in B2B. It might not be immediately for us, but somewhere down the people we work with and our customers and their customers, there's critical stuff going on.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that where do you draw the line? Even as a parent, there's been discussion around whose jobs are critical and therefore can they send their kids to school? And I think it is about those clear NHS and other key workers. Let's not get mixed up in that. And as I talked to you about previously, one of my real concerns with a lot of the marketing communication, if we bring it back to that, is some organizations are really doing the right thing introspectively with their employees, but out there as well to potential customers. And we're B2B in the main, and that's all about generating leads and keeping salespeople happy. That's still a challenge now, but you can't go out and be what I would call an ambulance chaser, going out with messaging that's so clearly designed to try and angle a sale, just very inappropriate. And I think that can be a much larger harm for a business. Is that the other piece to this leadership is not just making quick, effective decisions. It's also thinking about that balance of we need short-term business, but how do we do the right thing by our audience that means we build a longer term, or at least keep those longer term relationships going, particularly with customers as well, which I think may be missed. And you made this point to me the other day around retention and how important that is.
I think there's just so many great points there. I think the fact that it is so difficult and the trading situation is difficult for many companies, actually communicating what you're doing to your staff, in effect, to keep the lights on. And the most important thing at the moment for any company is cash flow, particularly if you're small. And what are you doing to that? Employees are very worried about their jobs, particularly here in the UK, because the government's introduced this furlough scheme, which is fantastic, but you've got to get it right. So they want to know, the implications for them. Be very interested from some of our colleagues and friends around the world to share their experiences of how their governments are handling that. But really, in terms of business strategy, you've got this immediate need to keep the lights on. It is always cash is king, and that has to come first for any board. And that's been taking up quite a lot of my time this week. And then the second, and I think this is really interesting to reflect on it now as we sort of go into this, is capacity planning for some organisations is the most important thing. They are completely overloaded. I mean, we all know it from the online shopping point of view, but they're not the only ones.
No, I think you're right. I think it's an interesting point around how those organisations that are at capacity differentiate as well. So what are the lessons that any business can learn from how companies are handling that? And one of the things we wanted to talk about today is who's doing a good job of this. Anyone you've observed, particularly when it comes to differentiating in that capacity, rather than head down, just get on with it, is also keeping their eye open on how to communicate and to be wise, to use data, things like that to help the cause.
I think that's a great question, Steve. And I think this is where marketing can really help. I was super impressed. I mean, there's obviously the battle of the retail wars going in a very funny way, which is about, managing the demand and the communications from the chief execs. They're all doing a good job, all of the supermarkets. The one that stands out for me is Sainsbury's. I think they are really setting the tone, and they're the only one that's come across to me as being data led. They were the first supermarket to actually make online slots available to their known vulnerable and elderly customers using the data. But the letter that the chief digital officer sent out was very sensitive to how they'd done this. And then obviously that went viral. And then the chief exec had to follow up to say, yeah, we're going to try and give everybody in this category priority. We don't have the data. We've appealed to the government to share that data so we can open that up. Basically using data for the good. And I think this could well change the conversation in the future about how data is used.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I was on the other end of that from a point of view of trying to book a click and collect slot with Sainsbury's and being told as I went through that as I logged in, we've recognised that you are not a priority based on your data, which may seem a little bit cold, but in this circumstance is exactly the right thing to do. And I think 99.9% of reasonable humans would understand that. And then 99.9% of marketeers and data people will say, wow, what a great use, as you say, of effective positive data rather than the last few years of stories of woe and worry about where data is being used. I think that then boils back, Shane, to just doing the right thing. So that leadership point of just being a good human being. It's really easy to say, but actually Sainsbury's are trying to do the right thing by their customers, by the wider world, and indeed their employees as well. And actually, I think for me, that's where I've spotted some interesting differences in market. So my background and where we work quite a lot is in education and technology in education, and certain brands in there have seen not the chance to sell, although depressingly, one of the leaders in that market I was looking at earlier just for research sake, their answer to this is 50% off if you buy our product now. Whereas others in that market are just saying, look, have our products. In fact, better than that, we've been really rapidly, back to that agile approach, creating assets that can help you. And their target market is schools, colleges, universities. But they've also said, here are some things for parents. Back to my point around my team and others that are parents, the struggle is how does one balance the work commitment we've still got with making sure we're now a home teacher as well. So what really struck me about that, and brands, not just small ones, so Creative Hut, who are a small startup in that space, really smart use of video as well to just do daily, almost the Joe Wicks of education, if you will. But Discovery Education, part of the Discovery Channel network, big organization, can prove that you can make rapid changes and say, look, let's bring down paywalls, let's get people into the product. And by the way, if you do that, they start to use the product. What's the likelihood of them continuing to use that product when this chaos and this crisis is over? It's very strong. And that could be another learning, I think, is forget these trials and forget putting people on short-term payment options, roll the product out, roll the opportunity out and see if in the long term it pays back. Brave thing to say because we've got to feed, as you said, cash flow is king, but maybe that long term, that the good will out, so to speak.
I love that. And I think that's, I won't say a luxury, but perhaps it is a luxury that those who've got the deep pockets can do that, or they're there for the public good. I completely agree. Things like the BBC are doing in terms of making more resources available, the fact that museums have opened their virtual galleries for free, really helpful. But they're in the world of public good. That's their, that's very much heart of their brand. For other organisations that are used to quarterly sales forecasts and having to deliver a certain number of leads and demand generation, that's really tough. Where do you go? And I think, to your point, that explanation that needs to come from the marketing team about linking the fact it's going to be about being around for the long term is so important. And it's about, as you say, starting with your customers and doing the right thing by them, because there is demand amongst customers in certain sectors. And I think the marketers have got to be on the front foot communicating this to the board, helping them see where those opportunities are. As you say, not ambulance chasing, not sending out thousands of emails, but being really smart about this. Hard though.
Yeah, I don't think it's just marketing as well. I think the opportunity theoretically is to rethink the use of other resource. So if you've got salespeople that typically would have been on the road or on calls, they can't do that now because the people they would have been meeting and talking to may not be as visible. So where can we apply that resource to help out? So is there a chance for salespeople to get into things like social selling, to get into things like research, i.e., where are the verticals that seem to be a market we'd never thought of before? I don't know if you've seen any of that coming out in the last few days.
That's a brilliant spot, because actually I was on a call with the B2B DMA Council, and it's a group of peers where we basically support the work that the DMA does, and we use each other as sounding boards. And we had a really great, helpful call this morning, and that was one of the top topics that came out from about 4 different people, was that actually this recognition that it's been a challenge for a long time for those with physical salespeople, and it's getting harder, that world. But oh my goodness, overnight their world has changed. So how do you pivot them, not to be necessarily social sellers, because as we said, we don't want ambulance chasers, but people who perhaps are not comfortable because their environment has been a physical event, or it's been going and meeting the client in their office. How do you give them the skills to meet out and basically create those relationships virtually? So funny you say that, because I've actually had to do 3 proposals this week for exactly that topic.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's really reassuring in terms of, funny enough, actually, in the social selling bit, and my bugbear on this, it's the same as yours, is a terrible name for a great idea. Is that it's not about getting onto the internet, sending a few tweets and selling stuff. It is much more about social engagement, social relationship building, which in a lot of the markets that I operate and your background is, where it's not a quick sale, this strikes me as a really obvious way to keep salespeople not just busy, because busy's easy, but productive busy is the really important thing for them to do, where they can strengthen relationships by using the fact that, I've not seen, and this is something I want to look at in the next week or two, is data around how much more has LinkedIn been used, for example, in the last week or the last couple of weeks, because of people being captive audience to it. So that give them the confidence, as you say, and the skills through that training. The other bit is, of course, is feed them with the right ammunition. And this is back to marketing again, and an area that we've been spending time on in the last couple of weeks with clients is making sure that there's enough good content out there for the marketing campaigns where they can run, but then pivot it into sales. Give the salespeople useful, relevant, interesting stuff to share so that they can at least keep relationships going, even if they can't keep lead generation going.
I think that's such an important point. And for those listening that are from the agency point of view, this is your opportunity. This is where the skills lie to help marketing teams take what they've got, which is perhaps not really suitable and fit for purpose in the way it's going to be used now, and chunk it and change it up and make something much more exciting and compelling. And I know, you've been doing it for a long time, Steve, but that's, I think, very exciting, and we should see a new way of working coming out of this. And the fact that we're so lucky in the UK and in Europe with great agencies who can do this. So yeah, I'd really advise anybody looking for help on that to look externally. I think it's a great tip.
Well, I think the other, and this is not with my agency hat on, but I think this is the opportunity for clients. And what I've seen from other agency leads, which is really positive, and I believe, because I know the characters, they're offering up free help, free advice, because there is more time perhaps than the core day to day, less meetings, less pitches, is look, if you just need a chat. And I think this is a thing we can all do more of, as long as it's done on the right levels, that it is just a genuine value add, is agency leads, specialists that can just help these clients say, in the example of what you've just given, actually, one of the things we've found really quickly through content is a lot of marketing content is, of course, centered on a different part of the conversation, salespeople. So the gap is, well, the sales enablement assets that they need, which a few weeks ago would have been a really down hot sales presentation PowerPoint, is now bite-sized stuff that if they do have a chat via LinkedIn or some kind of messenger or Zoom or the other, my goodness, I wish I'd have bought shares in Zoom, by the way, in the last few weeks. Those kind of technologies that actually, they just need bite-sized presentations that are fit for purpose. So I think there's a lot of advice that the kind of wisdom of crowds can and will offer, which is back to your point again. Yeah, on a humanity level, it's really, really nice to see that people are trying to pull together. People that may have been competitive or aloof to one another are just trying to muck in, which is, the more of that, the better, I say.
I think so. And I also would urge caution in terms of thinking, oh, great, brave new world. What all our customers want is free training on Zoom in terms of us offering assets out there. And my experience is that actually there's a complete overload, and everybody, I don't know how many you've done this week, is getting to a sort of fatigue very quickly on doing lots of video calls and actually managing that. So I think we've got to be very cautious in the way we use this new media, and it's whether it's emails, we're sending out too many, do our unsubscribe rates bounce up high, we get people unsubscribing, and I think that's a topic for another day. But also exactly the same on, don't just go, right, everybody, we're going to do webinars for our clients, because oh my goodness, already there's so much out there.
Yeah, I mean, this is the classic, everybody's on Facebook, we should be on Facebook, or everybody's on LinkedIn, we should be on LinkedIn, is we can rush to the party and saturate it. So it's about recognizing the right time to use these things, for sure. I think your point about email is, and it's an interesting hypothesis, will we see things like unsubscribes spike? Counter to that, and I think it will just be the data that argues this one for us, will we find more engagement because people who haven't got meetings that typically would delete communication because they haven't got time but might have interest? It might be the reverse. I think the thing for me that I'm interested in the next few weeks is, will send time change? So best practice to send out communication, whether it's your emails and other social media posts, etc. I suspect that will change because our working patterns are changing so considerably as well. And you alluded to this something when we met a while back around how you think the channels might change. So I'm sure you mentioned radio and areas like that might have traditionally not been the heartland of B2B markets to perhaps be a consideration. What was your thinking on that?
Absolutely, because I think we can take lessons from those who've been in those markets before. SMEs traditionally much more consumer media, so I think we'll see a spike in TV, radio, and obviously fantastic programmatic into the digital space, be it Facebook or whatever, is already happening. The government's doing it. I mean, if you go on to any article about the virus, the government is targeting its ads brilliantly with the wash your hands safe message. So we can learn a lot from that. What is helpful to our audience, I think, has got to come first is, what are they worried about? What do they need? And how can we help them? It's about that. And then looking, where are they? As you say, the whole world of working at home, our media consumption is completely different.
Yeah, I bang on about this all the time. Helpful sells, no more so than now, that if you can find the time, whether it's that free advice, whether it's on a webinar, via email, whatever the means, to just get under the skin of what are the concerns of those customers, as you said, we mustn't miss. Although markets are so greedy often for lead generation and acquisition, our customers are never more important. Get under the skin of how can we adapt, how can we help, and help, as I said, I think is a long-term sales strategy for sure.
Yeah, I had a lovely...
Just changing the... Go on, Shane, sorry.
It's all right. I had a lovely expression this morning. It's sort of COVID now, COVID in the future, planning for both. And I think that's the way we need to be thinking about, our new world and what we do now, and also thinking ahead. And I think I heard something very important, which is true, is that businesses and behaviours that pivot today may never come back. They may be completely different. I mean, we're already seeing, and we were already moving into a cashless society, but boy, has that accelerated through this.
Yeah, well, I was going to go on to ask, it's not all doom and gloom. Who's winning out there? Where are the industries where we are, just by nature of this change, seeing huge growth?
Obviously, I've already mentioned government. Government is releasing loads of spend on different things. That's going to be here to carry us through both the pandemic crisis, but also the economic crisis that is here now. Technology's clear winner, but perhaps not all of them. Perhaps we'll really focus on what helps us. Old-fashioned call centres, let's face it, they are really inundated. There's just not the capacity. So things like chat. Somebody else said, and this was Brian Foss, he said lawyers are very busy, and boy is he right, because if you want to check your rent and your landlord clause or your force majeure for cancelling an event, you're going to your lawyers, and particularly if they're well set up for working remotely. I really like that one. Delivery businesses, logistics, we can go on and on. There are
Yeah,
so many
yeah.
sectors.
Well, we could go on, and I think that's the thing to not dismiss, and why we wanted to start this was just we've actually got a bit of time to do it. This isn't doom and gloom. This is what this podcast was about. It was about there are an awful lot of ups for a lot of industries because of that, as you say, that change in direction. A friend of mine, for example, a neighbour, he works in second-hand van sales. He's a manager in an organisation in that space. They've never been busier because of home deliveries versus retail shopping in the traditional way. The demand for those products has gone through the roof. They can't actually find enough inventory to keep up with demand. So it isn't all doom and gloom for sure. It is just a change of direction in a lot of ways. The interesting bit will be, as you said, how much of it will we default back to? How much have we got muscle memory on our behaviours, whether that's as humans, but particularly with our hats on with marketing and sales? Will we just go back to those older school, and by old school I mean a month ago, ways that we would try and lead generate and work on prospecting, or will we see this as a chance to drop a lot of the stuff in the past that perhaps we just didn't need to do?
That's really interesting. So what do you think, what else will we drop, Steve?
Well, interesting. I think the number of face-to-face meetings, so particularly marketing for me, having worked a lot on lead generation programs, and as anyone listening in that space knows, the pain of generating leads that are sales accepted, marketing qualified to sales accepted leads. I think the requirement for that to be I don't want to talk to them until I don't want to qualify them until I've met them. Well, the world has meant that although, as you rightly said, it's not all about just using Zoom as much as possible, but I think people will be more comfortable with virtual first meetings. So that will take that requirement out. And dare I say it, although it's an industry I love dearly and I see a lot of value in, events, the idea that we must always default to an event or a trade show, which a lot of the clients I've worked with over the years have always done, clearly they can't do it. So will that mean that those events will carry on? Or perhaps they'll have to innovate and think about, as some companies are, how do you deliver the same experience but create virtual events? And if you do that, does that suddenly open up a much wider world to you because you've got no geography constraints like you might have in the world where you physically host an event?
Two massive points there. I mean, events, you asked, the whole point of this, how have we spent our week? I would say that's probably about 80% of my week has been talking to clients who have got physical events that have been cancelled and they're trying to transition them to digital. And I think the point you made about experience is really important. A digital event is going to be completely different to a physical event. So how do you create that wow? And I think companies putting effort into that. It's interesting to hear Jason from the Crocodiles say they're already working on that, about how do you create amazing digital CX, because actually we're human beings, and going to an event, there is a need to mingle with our community. We like it. People who go to those events, there's a reason they do. So how are we going to recreate some of those very human experiences? And it's going to be really tough. But I think on average, the stat is for B2B budgets, 65% of the budget is spent on physical events. I don't think that's ever going to come back to that level.
No, and I think my friends that I work with quite often, the Association of Event Organisers, AEO, who are front and centre on that, not only rightly are lobbying away to say how is the government going to support that industry, but equally there'll be a lot of thought, and it will have already been going on because this has been a trend that's been coming for a while, is what will the next trade show look like in, and I would have said 10 years ago, but it's going to be in 10 years time, but it's going to be 2 years time now, if not in 6 months, because of this shift. And without being doom and gloom, I dare say that the fear of travelling and spending time in close proximity with others will also make it easier to justify doing these virtual events, because there will be, unfortunately, a hangover of worry that will this happen again? not just at a personal level, but businesses. And back to your point when we started around contingency planning, is I suspect a lot of contingency plans and documents have had to rapidly change, if they have at all, to take into events like Corona that would have never have been on the roadmap before. So I think it will accelerate that digital transformation because of necessity, but also perhaps for the good as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to accelerate other societal trends as well. I mean, there was a brilliant book, and I think it was written about, it may be longer than 10 years ago, by Francis Cairncross, who was a writer for The Economist, and it was called The Death of Distance. And it was about every generation that global distances shrink. As a geographer, past geographer, it's the sort of thing that really interests me. But we're here now because actually, with this technology, and the fact that we're all looking for learnings from around the world as to how people, cultures, countries are learning from this experience, be it about the spread of disease or data. But I think we'll actively seek out and how are businesses coping with this. And in fact, that's already happened. I had my first inquiry from New Zealand, and I can't see that having happened a year ago. They'd been too worried about time zones or whether you can make it work. But there's just an assumption now we'll make it work.
Yeah. 1997, by the way, Shane.
Oh, thank you.
There you are. You're welcome. Slightly over than 10 years, but still very relevant. Really good point in terms of how the world, funny enough, with air travel disappearing, certainly in the short term, that the world is still a lot smaller than it was, which is an encouraging thing. So looking ahead, not necessarily so far ahead, what's the week got in store for you? What's coming next up for you? Where are you spending your time, do you think, in the coming days?
I absolutely know where I'm spending my time. I have, in the next 24 hours, got to become an expert user of Zoom for training, because my face-to-face training, like you, that takes up a lot of time, of course, has all pivoted to be delivered online instead. And my 20-something-year-old children just laugh at the fact that I am going to be grappling with technology and not necessarily an instant expert, but taking tips from people like you and others who are already there and doing things like the whiteboarding and the functionality and the thumbs up. So I should be doing lots of online tutorials to make myself a better online and hopefully interactive trainer. So that's going to keep me quite busy for next week.
Well, that's good to know. And I think, to be honest, my learning on that, apart from the fact I've seen you speak many times before, you won't need to worry. It is about keeping the quality of the content rather than the medium. It is to keep it simple. I learned this a long time ago, probably 20 years ago. I was asked to research WebEx and other tools for client-side usage. And my conclusions quite quickly were you need to treat online training or online meetings a little bit like TV production. If you're creating a TV show, although I have no hands-on experience of it, it's bite-sized scripted chunks that mean you're not asking too much long-term concentration of people. And although you're right, the technology's there for all these whizzy bits, to be honest, keep it simple, keep talking. And back to a point I made earlier, I think the brilliant thing that this change in working patterns has brought in the last couple of weeks is we're just so much more relaxed about somebody making a mistake with a webinar. I mean, particularly being British, it would be impossible to live down the fact that you might have accidentally pressed the wrong button on a webinar 2 months ago, but now people just see it as normal. And in fact, if you haven't got some kind of background noise, child running across the back of the scene, as my wife experienced earlier when she was trying to record something and my daughter decided it'd be a great time to do some kind of performance dance behind her, which worked fantastically from a comedic point of view, and the audience loved, but would have crippled that presenter a few weeks ago, is we can just use the technology and continue to be human to human best we can. Anything else in your week ahead?
I think that I'll be doing hopefully a little bit more thinking, because one of the worries is that I thought that there'd be more time. And I have been really surprised, and I think this has been actually feedback from others I've been talking to, that this working from home and all that extra time that we're supposed to have with no commuting and all the rest of it, we're just all working flat out. And I think that that's just for anybody else feeling a bit sort of like that is really common. And I need to find some space to think, because the thinking is what's going to get us through this. And I'd really hope that people join the conversation and their challenges and their learnings, because that will really help all of us
Yeah, good. And in fact, it's one of my tasks for the week ahead is when we next record this in the next week or so, or over the next couple of episodes, I'd really like to get others involved. We are in the UK and we can see things at one angle, but there's others out there that we will be connected to and might listen to this that have got a completely different take because of where they are in the world. So that's on my task list.
What
Alongside
else
that,
is on that? I'm going to say what else is on your task list.
well, alongside that, I mean, just business as usual. We are really, really busy at Junction, which is great. It is a lot about that adaptation, as I mentioned, from where we spend a lot of time creating content that might be more for marketing led, is helping feed salespeople with useful stuff so that they can also keep busy and not busy for busy's sake, but productive. However, I think is a really important tip is just knowing when to switch Zoom off. It's a little bit like the early days of email, which it was such a temptation to go in and check your email, particularly when you're just about to go to bed or do more than perhaps you should, is you've got to maintain that balance and be able to switch off, albeit a slightly different working pattern than perhaps we're used to.
Yeah, I for one am very grateful, and I know you make use of it too, of the recommended exercise break and getting outside and being able to walk in the park. It just get outside and yes, hopefully
Well,
feel the
yeah,
sunshine.
I think it's an interesting one because I think it's a hard challenge. I mean, I learned this over the last 4 or 5 years of mixing my time between office and home that I am now, and it's taken me that long to be comfortable with the fact that I might stop during a working day and go out for a run for half an hour, 45 minutes. A lot of people will have that temptation, but they need, again, back to maybe it's one of those points from the start where on leadership is management encouraging and saying, look, it's okay to take a break in the middle of the day. Go out and play with your kids, go out for that run or walk. And if it's anything like my village, where it's normally quiet in the week, I think everybody in the village has signed up to do Duke of Edinburgh in the last couple of weeks, Shane, just in terms of the amount of activity out there. People that wouldn't necessarily go out for a run are suddenly in all sorts of garish running gear. So I feel in good company on that front at last.
Yeah, and I think that's a good way to close, is that actually it is about all of us keeping healthy, and that leaders can really encourage their teams to do that, and makes a big difference to everybody.
Does indeed. Good. Okay, Shane, let's leave it there. Thanks ever so much. I'll speak to you
Cheers.
this time next week.
Thanks, Steve. Yes, that'd be great.
See you soon.